Cool. Well, while we're waiting for people to file in, I'm just going to go ahead and get started with the necessary preamble. You know, I'm very excited to welcome all of our co-hosts to the show today. They'll all get a chance to introduce themselves. But before we do that, I just wanted to highlight and say, you know, we all work at the companies that we work at. I think probably with the exception of Domo and RXA, right? We're just here like having a community session, kind of expressing some ideas, exchanging ideas. They may or may not necessarily be in alignment with the views of the companies we work for, I guess. So, you know, whatever that disclaimer is, just get that out there and out of the way. I'm pretty stoked about the agenda we've got lined up today. Andrea and Dan are going to be talking about Adrenaline and some of the ways we can upload data into Domo and partition, replace, and UPSERT and all those things. Our friends from RXA are going to present a little bit about building a custom pipeline using the Java CLI and getting data into Domo fast. And then Elliott's got some content about building out some custom connectors and some alternatives to using to actually coding custom connectors, because that can be a non-trivial tech burden. So that's the kind of the general gist of things. Feel free to drop questions in chat. We've also linked a Google Doc where we're collecting kind of community questions. If there's anything we can't get to within this hour, we'll try to address it in a follow-up blog post or as well as a follow-up email. But yeah, I kind of want to stop talking and get started. So Dan and Andrea.
Good deal.
Over to you.
Thanks, Jay. Thanks for having us. Thanks for everybody for being here. I guess I'll just introduce myself really quickly, and then Andrea, maybe you can do the same, and then we'll dive into the content. My name is Dan Brinton. I've been with Domo for August will be 5 years. In that time, I started out in our consulting organization, so doing Domo implementations for our customers. And then for the last 2 years or so, I've been one of our technical solution managers. So we work closely with our CSMs to support, you know, many of you, I believe, are Domo customers. So we work closely with our CSMs. The CSMs pull us in to address, you know, a particular technical question. Maybe there's a new use case, and we're trying to, our customers are trying to understand how they can use Domo products and tools to accomplish their business objectives. Anyway, happy to be here, and thanks for having us.
Hey, I'm Andrea. I've been with Domo about 7 years now. Like Dan, grew up in consulting. And then when he split off to TSMs, I kind of split off into a role reporting to our VP of data curiosity, more around data pipeline and architecture. So happy to be here.
Cool. And we're going to start off just really laying some foundation when it comes to data ingestion and accumulation in Domo. So when we talk about loading data into Domo, we've got a number of methods for doing that, right? Replace is the most, and I'm talking in terms of like Domo connectors or Workbench, right? So replace is going to be the default and certainly the most common. When we're doing a replace, when we're using the replace method, we're only ingesting data. That is to say, we're not also accumulating it. If we want to talk about ingesting and accumulating, then we can look at append or UPSERT or partition. And I'm going to go into all of these in a lot more detail here in a minute. But just at the summary level, replace and append, those are the two methods that have been around for a long, long time, right? They're ubiquitous. All of our connectors and Workbench support those two methods. But then over the course of the last, I don't know, handful of years, hopefully you've started to see more UPSERT and partition capabilities, both in connectors and also in Workbench, and we should say also in programmatic methods. So Jeff is going to be talking about a pipeline involving the CLI tool, I think using some of these same methods. Okay, so what I want to do is compare and contrast each of these methods and talk about, you know, what they are, but then also sort of the appropriate use cases for each, right? So let's start with the simple, and I'm going to go through replace and append pretty quickly. When we talk about a replace, the incoming data completely replaces any existing data, right? And so that's why we can't use a replace to do data accumulation. So it's the simplest to set up, it's the easiest to maintain, and for that reason, it's kind of nice, right? But if we need to do data accumulation, it's not really appropriate. So when do we want to use a replace? When the incoming data, when really the total data is small enough that the time to do the full data ingest and replace is kind of immaterial, right? So maybe we're talking about dimension tables, we're talking about maybe small transactional tables. And again, this is the simplest method, and it's probably the preferred method, especially for small data, especially if there are like lots of changes in that data historically. So with append, here's where we can start to accumulate data. With the append, all we're going to do is we're going to take the new incoming data, we're going to append it to the end of any existing data, and that's it, right? There's no intelligence there. It just takes everything that's new, adds it to everything that's old, and that's it. So it's really efficient because we don't have to mess with any of the historical data to do this operation, but it's not fault tolerant. So any kind of upset can basically corrupt your data. So for example, let's say that you've got an append process that's running once daily. If for some reason that process runs twice in a day, now you've got duplicate data, right? So somebody accidentally runs the connector manually, for example. Or for whatever reason, a connector fails one day. The credentials have expired, or there's an outage on the source data platform or whatever. Now you've got a gap in your data. So the append method is not fault tolerant. And for that reason, I don't generally recommend it. I'm sure there are appropriate use cases. We could probably brainstorm some here today. But in general, I don't really use the append method much. And so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. Okay, let's talk about UPSERT. So this is one of the relatively newer methods. For those of you that come from like a data or SQL background, you're probably familiar with an UPSERT operation. And when we talk about that in the Domo context, it's basically the same as what you're thinking of in a database context. So it's a row level operation, and Domo is going to ingest new data from the source. It's going to look at each row of data, and it's going to ask the question, does this row of data already exist in Domo? If yes, the new incoming row is going to update the existing row. And if no, then the new incoming row is just going to be appended to the existing data. So I mentioned it's a row level operation. That means we need to have a primary key. We need a unique identifier. We need to be able to uniquely identify each row in the incoming data. And it's a little bit processing intensive because it is a row level operation. So when would we want to use UPSERT? Data that's going to be too large to ingest all rows in a timely fashion, meaning the replace method is not really viable because of the time to ingest the data. UPSERTs are going to be good when we're talking about frequent updates to, excuse me, I think I misspoke. UPSERT is going to be good when we're talking about frequent updates in historical data. So you might think about large dimensional tables in which records are being frequently updated. So maybe it's a table of customers, right? And there are a bunch of customer attributes, address and phone number and primary contact person and whatever else. And you can imagine all of those attributes are subject to change over time. UPSERT might be an appropriate way to keep Domo updated as those changes are being made to existing customers and also as new customers are being added to the table. It can also be appropriate for transactional tables, especially if there are going to be any kind of updates in the historical transactions. That's a less common scenario. Typically a transactional table is going to be immutable, but we do see use cases where it's a transactional table, but then there's some transaction attribute that might be updated over time. And anyway, UPSERT may be appropriate in situations like that. But let's then move on to partitioning, because this is partitioning is kind of the, partitioning is the thing that I'm most excited about when we talk about Domo data pipeline in general. And think about partitioning kind of like, it's kind of like we're taking the best things about replace and the best things about append and the best things about UPSERT and kind of mashing it all together. So with partitions, instead of this being a row level operation, it's a partition level operation. A partition being just a chunk of rows, right? And each of those partitions is going to be identified by a tag or a key, okay? And when that data is ingested into Domo, the data will be processed as partitions instead of as rows, as was the case with UPSERT. So for example, we ingest data and we identify 2 partitions. If a partition already exists, that partition, the incoming partition or the incoming data for that partition will completely replace the existing data for that partition. If the partition does not already exist, then that partition and that data in that partition are simply appended to the existing data. So that's what I mean when I say it's kind of like the best parts of all of the other methods, right? You get the efficiency of append. You get the efficiency because we're dealing with partitions rather than rows compared to UPSERT. And you also get the ability to accumulate data that you did not get with replace. Okay, so when would we want to think about using partitions? So again, when the data is too large to do a full replace is going to be your first indicator. It's especially good when there are no changes to historical data or when there are infrequent changes to historical data. And yeah, we can talk about that when we talk about use cases if we'd like. It does require an appropriate partition tag. And that's probably the most difficult thing about setting up a partition scheme is really you need to understand the nature of your data and you need to understand the nature of the processes that deliver the data in order to identify what the appropriate partition tag will be.
Just to jump in on that for half a second.
Yeah, thank you.
Guys, if it helps any, one of the ways I like to think about it is basically I'll always use partition or almost always use partition if the data has a date column that I can split my data on. That's probably the most common use case. You've got transactional data, whether it's financial or sales or whatever, and I'll partition on a day or maybe a month, and I'll load a month of data or a day worth of data each time, and each partition is that day. Okay, yeah, check. That's the partition use case. The UPSERT use case, and I think Dan already said this, is like if I have a customer table or an item table or a list of deals, they don't have a clean date column. So I'll use the UPSERT key as the customer ID or the item ID as the UPSERT key that uniquely identifies one row in the table, and that's how I can implement UPSERT. Now we only have 5 minutes left from you guys. Dan and Andrea, I know we were kind of wondering where in Domo can I see these different features? I know it's kind of expanding. I know there's some interesting betas coming out. What can you tell us?
Sure. So previous to now, partitioning and UPSERT were really only available at ingest. So replace and append has been available in all of our ingest methods for a long time. But previously, partitioning and UPSERT were only available through Workbench, or if you created a custom pipeline like RxA is going to talk about here in just a minute. It is available for some database connectors, like if you think about Snowflake, partitioning is available in those connectors. But now, partitioning is actually available through Magic, and it is in beta currently, but trundling speedily toward GA, and it has the opportunity to really improve a lot of your current data pipelines, which is what I'm so excited about. I kind of became the unofficial spokesperson for the Magic and Partitioning feature because I was so enthusiastic about it. People have joked that like partitioning is my entire personality now, which I'll take, it basically is. So yeah, I don't know, Dan, if I can show you very quickly how it works in Magic. So previously, if you wanted to do something like a snapshot in Domo, in order to do it in Magic, you had to create this recursive pattern in which you're feeding back in your output data set into the data flow in order to bring in and append on new rows for that snapshot. You know, super inefficient. This design pattern always made me cry because, like, why are we reprocessing data just to add data to it? What a pain. But now in Magic with the beta, you have the ability to identify partitions. So in this case, it's just being partitioned on year. That means that the data is stored in such a way in Domo that when the new year's data is coming through the pipeline, you can just have it added on as its own new partition. Or if it was identifying a previous partition, say you figured out a previous year was corrupted, it would just replace straight across the partition as it exists in your output data set, which is really cool, really efficient, means you're not reprocessing this whole thing when you don't need to be, and it gives you a lot more scalability with your pipelines. People are saying, well, I need that big historical data set in order to do trending, to build these cards. Previously, we're like, well, do you really need it all? Maybe you can shrink it down, maybe you can have aggregates, whatever. With partitioning, it gives you the ability to maintain that huge output data set that you need in order to do your trending or build your cards without having to reprocess it in order to update or add data to it. So we're really excited about that. I realize we're kind of at our time limit here.
Well, just before we switch over to RxA, I mean, I know for organizations that I've worked with, they've really benefited from the ability to use partition in Magic to accumulate data. So those of you who have recursive data flows, I strongly recommend that you investigate whether or not this might be beneficial for you. You'll notice that Andrea is demoing from Domo, dojo.domo.com. That is the community instance of Domo. We have that beta available for you guys to touch and play with right now. You can see right here, she's in the output tile. And typically we don't even see this dropdown replace append partition. We just see, well, we assume that Magic ETL is just doing a replace, but with this beta, we now get the ability to append or partition. Can you also show the partition tab on that data set for us?
Sure.
Because that was a pretty slick improvement to the UI. Data sets that have partitioning enabled will have this partition tab where you're able to see what are the partition tags on this data set and how many rows are part of that partition. And that includes both stuff that's gone through Magic ETL as well as things that have gone through, have been partitioned via the connector or any other space where you might have a connector.
Yeah. Where Domo knows about partitioning anywhere, it knows about it everywhere about your data set. So if you want more detail about this, I did a webinar about it. Domo Lunch and Learn. You should be able to find it on the Domo YouTube channel. So you can see in more detail and more examples of how this works.
Just a couple quick questions from the community. Juliana asks, is there an easy way to rework existing recursive data flows? Yes-ish. You have to run the historical data set through Magic ETL to apply partition tags, right? So if I have a data set that has 20 years worth of data, I have to run it successfully through ETL in order to partition it into years. And at the moment, Domo does have a couple constraints on how many partitions one Magic ETL job can produce. So for example, if you're partitioned by day and you had 2 years worth of data, I think the limit is currently 500 in one Magic
1,500.
job.
It's been raised. Yep, it's 1,500.
Okay, so
both
you can only
per data set and per execution is 1,500.
Nice. Okay, so you just have to be aware of, like, if I run this Magic ETL job, how many partitions am I creating? Emily asks if there's a link that we can share for partitioning within Magic. Emily, we will invite you to the Domo Dojo if you're not already there, and I'll also make sure to include a link to this data flow that Andrea was demoing from. Awesome. Tons of questions. Love it. Keep asking them. Keep putting them into chat. We'll address them as we can. I don't want to take any more time from Jeff. Jeff, hit us with your custom pipeline.
Okay, so I'm Jeff Doak. I'm head of solutions at RxA. My picture's in there. Catherine is also here on the right. She's CTO. Basically, we are a Domo partner. We specialize in business intelligence and AI, a lot of machine learning stuff, and have been a premier partner of Domo for a really long time. The obligatory list of clients, including Ford and ESPN. I think I'm personally in over 130 or 140 instances of Domo across various clients we've had over the last 6-7 years. And then, as I mentioned, we're currently Partner of the Year. We've won a few of these sort of things. We love Domo. We actually work outside of Domo sometimes, but generally we try to push clients into Domo because it's such a great platform to work on. And the CLI tool I'm about to talk about is really one of the reasons I think it's so great. So what I'm going to be talking about is pushing large data sets into Domo using the CLI tool, and a little bit about how to set that up programmatically so it can just run in the background. The use case for this specific client, they have multiple data sets with anywhere from 3 to 5 billion rows. Each day and it's 2 years of data in each set, basically. Each day we're updating about 30 days of data, and then every weekend, generally, we overwrite everything. And there's reasons we have to do that. Sometimes we overwrite just chunks of it. They also have a test environment that we have to do a smaller chunk of. So basically, this whole system was built so that I could pick any date range and push all of the data I needed to push as quickly as possible. As mentioned previously, standard Redshift connectors, Workbench, they're just too slow generally to do this type of work. And then the CLI tool not only allows uploads and partitioning, but I'm an old school PHP guy, so I wrote PHP scripts that basically automate this whole thing. General performance for this stuff, I can push about 500 million rows. And these rows contain 30 to 40 columns. A lot of them are text columns. So it's a total of 60 gig in about 30 minutes, plus indexing time, which I'll get into. But and because you can run several instances of this, you can do several sets all at the same time. So generally, when I'm running everything in all of the sets, I'm pushing about 1 billion rows an hour and indexed. So very, very fast, tons of data. What you'll need to be able to use this, obviously, familiarity with command line functions. You'll need a machine that has Java installed. I have Java installed on my local machine. I have a Linode server that's running a flavor of Linux, and that's got 24 gig of RAM on it. And then obviously, if you want to automate, you need some sort of programming language that can execute command line functions like Python or PHP or really anything that's your favorite. There's a couple of links here that I can put into the chat when we're done. The download location for the jar file, that's the actual CLI tool, and then the documentation is in there as well. So whatever data you have, you can probably use the CLI tool. I'm using Redshift data, but the tool also has functions for Hadoop, anything that can use a JDBC connection. If you've got data sitting in S3 buckets, or even if you've got CSV files, you can use the upload dataset function and grab those CSV files and actually make it even faster if you can zip them ahead of time. All of the different ways to push data through the tool are similar in that they allow for partitions or UPSERTs, and they can or will, in the case of Redshift, actually take your data set, the data set you're pushing, and actually break it into smaller pieces so that it can even happen faster. And that all sort of happens in the background. One of the reasons they're faster this is faster than Workbench is because Workbench actually has to format each row of data as it's pushing, and it does data validation. The CLI tool doesn't do that, so you have to make sure you know what you're doing and what you're pushing. Otherwise, it'll error out. But once you've got things locked down and it's running, it runs really, really well. So prep for this, obviously, you need the jar file. You need to throw it on your machine someplace and then execute it to verify that it actually returns the stuff you would want to see. And I can show you a screenshot of what that'll look like. Once you've done that, you then need to log into this on the web. Once you do that, you'll need to log into an instance. And that you use a security token, which I'm assuming most of you are familiar with that. You go into the security section of your Domo instance and grab an access token. And then you need to create a schema file, which is a JSON file that basically tells Domo what each column is, right? And there's a way using the CLI tool to do that easily. The way I usually do it is just export 1,000 rows of whatever data set I have to a CSV file, and then you can run this derive schema command that just, you point it to the CSV file, and then you give it a location where you want the JSON file dropped when it's done. It runs in about 1 second. And then once you've done that, you need to create the data set that you're going to push the data to. And again, similar thing, create data set, the name of the data set, and then the type. I usually just use CSV. It can be a variety of things, but this always works for me, so that's what I do. And then the file path to the JSON you just created. So really all of these steps can happen in about 5 minutes, and you've got really your data set ready to go, everything's running, and you can start pushing data. As we discussed previously, you need to determine your partition. I am doing a date. It's really easy. The date, the tag for the partition then is just the year, month, date without dashes. That becomes the tag that I'm using each time to overwrite data. So very easy for me to do 30 days of data, 60 days, you know, whatever I need to do. And then the execution, once you've connected to the instance, this is what one of the upload Redshift execute line would look like. Now it has a lot of variables in it because Redshift has a lot of things you have to handle, where your S3 bucket is, all the IAM stuff, the JDBC stuff, all of that's in there. Each of these upload commands, it has slightly different requirements for what you need. And again, that's all in the documentation. Once you're in the tool, you can just type help and then a space and then whatever command you need help with, and it'll give you all of the various variables that you would include in the command. And then for the way I do it, by the way, I don't index as I'm pushing each day. I run indexing periodically in the background as days are pushing, because if you wait until all 5 billion rows are pushed to run your indexing, which basically takes the data that's sort of sitting in the background and actually makes it live in Domo, it can take several hours in some cases. So as I'm doing like the big loads, I'm basically running this index dataset command in the background. So let me see, is there anything else I want to touch on here? Oh, real quickly, the letters you're looking at. So upload Redshift. There's the no index command in there. The -a is append, but I'm also using the -p, which is the part, which means I'm using a partition, and that's where the partition value would go. And then there's the Redshift query is in there as well. So it's generally a select star from the data set where date equals whatever the partition is. So it's fairly straightforward once you've played around with it a little bit and used it a couple times.
And just to jump in, if you could go back to that previous slide for half a second. And guys, many of us don't have Redshift, some of us do, but this design pattern is not limited to uploading data from Redshift, right? Domo, the CLI has tooling for just taking CSV files. So I was working with a partner that had a massive data set that we needed to partition. So we downloaded the data set into CSVs, like Jeff was saying, like 1,000 rows CSVs, and then uploading those CSVs using the upload data command. So it's not just limited to Redshift. You can pull data as CSVs. You can pull data from a couple other different database engines. But the concepts are all the same insofar as, like he was saying, functionally, partition is an append. Right, I'm adding data to an existing data set. And so all of these upload data commands many of them will have a partition parameter that you can optionally pass. Sorry, keep going.
No problem. And actually the upload dataset command, I think, even allows you just to point to a directory and it'll grab everything that's in there and upload it. So it's fairly easy to use. This is just to show you what it'll look like when you're actually in the command line. So you can see at the top, I've just typed in the command to start the execution of the command line. It explains what the command line is, what it can do a little bit, and then at the bottom tells you if you've got the current version. My version's a little old when I ran them this morning, but I'll update it soon. And then lets you know that it knows that you're Jeff Doak, and you can then move on to the next part. So a lot of stuff here. I'm not going to go through all of this in detail, but generally the top box, once I've executed the command, you can see that it says executing post, and it's pushing to a specific API endpoint to actually push the data. In the background, again, this is all happening automatically. It opens the connection to Redshift. It does my select star command. And then what it does basically is take whatever the results are. And then generally when I'm pushing one day, it's about 7 million rows. It zips all of that data up into a number of smaller files. So in this case, 12 files, and pushes them into an S3 bucket. And then just starts uploading those files one at a time. So started file part 1 upload. It'll say there's an attempt 1. Usually happens right after attempt 1. Sometimes it needs to attempt it a couple times if something weird's going on. And then just basically goes through and uploads all 12 of those files. And again, this is all happening sort of automatically. And then when it's done, it'll let you know that all the files have been finished uploading and that the whole data set is done. If you have indexing running, in this case I did, the next thing it does is another endpoint command to commit and then to basically run the indexing. When you run indexing, it'll sort of keep you updated on the status over here. So starting it's 0%, and then generally every few seconds a new line will be written to the screen letting you know what the percentage is done. And then once it's done, success 100%. It then deletes everything out of those S3 buckets. So from beginning to end, all I've done is basically say, do a select star, use this partition key. It runs everything, creates all of the data, splits it into pieces into your S3 bucket, pushes it all, indexes, and then cleans it out. So really, really clean. For the automation part, so again, I said I'm a PHP guy. We've got people on the team who are using Python to do this stuff as well. So I use the date partition and then loop through whatever date range I need. Generally, I'm pushing 60 days at a time. And the reason I'm doing that is because I actually have to do some aggregation on the set in the background before I upload it. So as one piece of it, the 60 days is uploading, I'm actually aggregating some other stuff in the background. And the way this actually fires to make it even faster is I have the PHP script actually executes 60 different instances of an upload. So they are all running at the same time. And as long as the machine can handle it, it's absolutely fine. And so I'm basically uploading all 60 days at the same time to the same data set simultaneously. And then as they get there, when they're done, basically index them. And as I said, I'll run that periodically in the background. Haven't had any issues with indexing while things are uploading. It seems to run fine. So tons of data very quickly. Real quickly, some potential issues you might run into. As with the Domo API for normal data set upload, your text fields can't contain any double quotes, at least in my experience. So those need to be replaced with double quotes so that they make it through the data. You must create the destination set using the CLI tool. Again, in the ways I've done it, I don't think you can actually just push to a data set that already exists, but again, very easy to do. Be careful with your partitions. That's not going to warn you if you're pushing data using the wrong partition key. Log everything. So the CLI tool lets you write to log files of everything that's happening. I even write PHP errors to another log so that if anything breaks, it's really easy to detect what happens. And it will break sometimes, and it's not necessarily Domo's fault. Sometimes Redshift, for instance, in my case, just goes down and needs to come back up again. So the script needs to constantly be checking, did something error out? If so, rest for a second, try it again. And I've basically got everything that I could possibly think of over the last 2 or 3 years that has happened that could be an error is now handled. And basically we'll keep things running. I think that's it. I know I tried to go really fast here so we could keep time. Again, I'm Jeff Doak. If you have any questions after this, you feel free to email me.
I guess just real quick before we transition over to Elliott. And Elliott, I know we're running into your time. there was so much content and so many brains that I wanted to bring to the table. 1 hour really doesn't give you guys justice. But out of the community and participants, is anybody using the CLI? Do any of you have experience with it? I would love for you guys to share, just for other people who might be shy about getting into scripting because it might seem overwhelming. It would just, share your experiences in chat a little bit if you've been playing around with the CLI. I know I started my first scripting line, 4 years ago when I started working with Domo. So, it's not beyond the realm of possibility. But while we wait for questions to go in, Elliott, talk to us. custom connectors, fall through methods, all the things.
Yes. Okay. I am super excited to be here. Yeah, I think the first thing I wanted to talk about, so, I am a big advocate for custom connectors. I've been building them for the last few years. And the first thing I want to talk about is I want to try and convince you to not build a custom connector, because
Get out.
Domo is such a good tool. And so what I want to highlight real quick is anytime I'm working with a client or a Domo instance, I always ask myself these two questions here about if I should build a custom connector. And if either of these are no, I am not going to build a custom connector. And so I'll explain it real quick. The first one is pretty simple, right? Will the data provide meaningful business value to our company? This one, I mean, I know it sounds kind of cheesy, but really, I can't tell you how many business stakeholders I've talked to where they don't understand why the data would be useful, right? They just want to pull it into Domo because it exists. And so really, can we quantify the ROI behind this data? What is it going to do? Is it going to help us integrate systems better? Is it going to help us, get better insights or analytics on a dashboard? So really, if the answer is no there, right off the bat, I'm not going to build a custom connector. The second one is if the connector will be reused by business users. And the reason I say this is because if you're going to go out of your way and build a custom connector, and you're more comfortable with using PyDomo or Python or something, I would recommend that you use PyDomo before you build a custom connector, because custom connectors can take a little bit to build, right? There's a review process that Domo will go through. It can take a couple weeks. You're able to self-publish it, which is great. But really, if it's not going to be reused by business users, I would definitely recommend that you go over, that you try and do what I'm going to talk about now, which is I want to talk about best practices for pushing data to Domo if you're not doing a custom connector. And so I kind of have 5 different kind of steps or keys that I wanted to highlight real quick. The first is that simple solutions are always better solutions, in my opinion. And the reason I say this is because Domo, it's such an easy platform to use. Time to value is often one of the most critical things, right? So getting the data in quickly and being able to iterate quickly is a lot more powerful than trying to, make a perfect process. And so I'm a big advocate of low code, no code. In my opinion, Domo has so many good connectors where you're able to easily teach business users how to use them. An example here is the email connector, right? I know a lot of us have used it. It's one of my favorite band-aids of all time in Domo. You're able to teach a business user easily how to use an email connector compared to creating a custom connector, writing JavaScript. Their eyes glaze over as soon as they look at it, right? They're not able to collaborate with it. And so one thing I take from this is, I think a couple years ago, Jay was mentioning, or I've taken this from Jay, but he said that oftentimes high code stuff is a non-trivial barrier for business users, right? So whether it be SQL, whether it be Python, it's a barrier to letting people participate in the process. And so if you want your business users and different stakeholders, such as data analysts, to participate in the process, try and do low code, no code, right? Try and go through this fall through process of different connectors before you go to the custom connector. And so this comes to our second point, which is leveraging pre-existing connectors and Domo's hidden gems. There's so many great connectors out there, and I have a few up here that I wanted to highlight, such as we have the email connector, the JSON no code, the JSON webhooks, the CSV SFTP push connector. These are all different connectors that you can use. And I actually learned a lot about these from a presentation that was given a couple of years ago, which was the Domo's hidden gems that Andy Beyer and Jay did as part of the idea exchange. I don't have time to talk about this too much, but I would definitely recommend, if you want to learn more about special connectors, I would definitely recommend go check out this video. It's really enlightening. It tells a lot about the different connectors that have been built. And in my opinion, yeah, I think there's a lot of hidden gems out there that can help you before you build a custom connector. The next one is to also get to know your software systems. So you really want to understand the software that runs your business, because I can't tell you how many times I've worked with clients where They're convinced that they need a custom connector. They're like, we got to build it. We got to build it. And then once you go look at some help articles, you can see that there's scheduled reports. So the email connector is possible. You can have hit APIs, so the JSON no code is possible. And so really, I would really highly recommend before you go into a custom connector, take a look at your softwares, make sure you understand them. And chances are, like, people, when they say that there's not a schedule report, my first response is, really? Like, let me take a look real quick. Like, let me make sure that that's true before we go in and do some more complicated stuff. The fourth one, yeah, make data quality a priority. Like I said, a lot of these we may consider to be band-aids. And so the way that you can mitigate band-aids is you make sure that the data quality is in check, right? And so an example, a common issue you have with the email connectors, maybe the vendor isn't sending the email on time, right? Maybe there's a latency there. And so making a data quality check with the data flow or a data set alert, right? Maybe alerting if the data is stale is a good way to mitigate that. And then the last one is building solutions that minimize dependencies. This here may be like, it may be a little it may be not counterproductive, counterintuitive, but in my opinion, if you have two ways to build a connector or to get data into Domo, you want to minimize the number of dependencies that you have, right? And so an example here is if I'm working with a third-party software that has an API that's pretty straightforward, like simple REST API, or the data set or a scheduled report connector, I might actually go with the API that has a better uptime and it's more guaranteed to send data because I have the control there, right? I'm able to hit the API. Let's say it has a 99.99% uptime. And in contrast with the email connector, you have to rely more on the provider, right? You have to make sure that the vendor is sending it to you every single time. And if they don't, then maybe you like log a support ticket or things like that. And so in my mind, yeah, trying to minimize dependencies is definitely important. But yeah, I think
Elliott, can I just jump? I mean, I love this slide so much because I think it really hits the nail on the head. Hits the nail, that's correct English. Yeah, on how we could think about approaching these projects, right? Like you said, some of these solutions might feel like band-aids, but if it allows a business user to get started on day one, building their data pipeline, getting that dashboard in Domo, getting that momentum behind it, like that's a non-trivial win. And if we reach the conclusion, hey, we need to hit the API, we need to like build something more sophisticated, once we have that buy-in and that confidence, that's when we'll hit up a Jeff or an Andrea and be like, hey guys, build me, or Elliott. I mean, Elliott, you write your custom connectors too, right? Right, but maybe that's the time to really go for like bulletproof data pipeline.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, I think the last thing, sorry, I want to talk about custom connectors, right? So I am a big advocate. I do love building them. I love it because for me, like it enables you to build, right? And so the biggest problem developers face is when they hit roadblocks that they can't overcome, right? And so I feel like the custom connector IDE enables me to build on my own. And for example, with self-publishing a custom connector, you're able to get data into Domo pretty quickly if you want to. And so if you are going this route, I have this process that I kind of follow, and there's a lot of text on this slide. I think really the key highlights is I love to use a tool called Postman, which I've done quite a few tutorials on it on my YouTube channel, but I like it because it's a great way to test and document the APIs that you're going to be hitting in your connector. And so I definitely recommend that. The chances are when you're building a custom connector, 100% you're going to be going back and updating it, right? You're going to be creating new reports, something breaks. And so having documentation and doing things like Git and Postman is so helpful in creating a custom connector before you even develop it in the IDE. And so I won't cover too much in depth on this. I would just say really, the biggest learnings that I've taken from building a dozen custom connectors that it does take time. And I recently started approaching custom connectors where I create a mono repo. And so actually this here is a public repo that I'll paste in chat real quick, because I've always found, kind of like what Jay was saying before, this stuff can seem scary, but the way you get started is you just look at other people's code and realize that there's a lot of boilerplate that goes into it, right? When we're creating Domo connectors, there is a lot of boilerplate that you're doing that can be repeated, right? The authentication script is pretty similar. The data processing scripts can be pretty similar. And so I would love it, if you're stuck, if you're have questions, take a look at these different connectors. There's a write back connector here and a couple others that I've built just as examples. And yeah, in my opinion, I just really think it's helpful to look at other people's code. And so the first thing I talked about was having a mono repo, right? So if you're building a lot of connectors, what I usually do is create a folder structure where I have a connector at the just an overall folder that's called connectors, and then each subfolder will be a connector that I'm working on. And so if I come in here into my HubSpot connector, for example, it's pretty simple. I have an authentication script, a data processing script, and then a markdown file where I'll show the reports that you would paste in when you're on the IDE that you'll be creating. And so for me, yeah, here, let me pull this up real quick in my VS Code as well. Right, so this makes it very easy to kind of organize yourself, right? So like I have, I'm able to look at all my different scripts, have my markdown file here, and I have this synced over to GitHub as well, right? So any changes that I'm making, if you're collaborating on a team, one of the hardest or biggest pain points is, the IDE doesn't necessarily let you collaborate, and so you have to turn to an external source like GitHub, for example, to collaborate more efficiently with building a connector, as well as version control and things like that. And so I definitely recommend, if you're on a bigger team, definitely leveraging GitHub, right? Commit your, make branches, make repositories for your connectors. Maybe have a mono repo structure like this to better organize connectors.
Elliott, just quickly, I see that HTTP request. I think that's a Domo specific function. Am I mistaken? And the underlying question is it possible to execute my code within Visual Studio Code, or do I ultimately have to copy paste into the IDE?
Yeah, great question. Yes, so this right here, this is what Jay was highlighting. This is a custom Domo method or library per se. If you come over to, if you're on developer.domo.com, there's this reference here that talks about all the different methods that you're able to use in the IDE. And so to answer your question, yes, you do have to develop and like run scripts in the IDE, because, like I said, like this library isn't available, as far as I know, in VS Code to
Right.
import. And so I kind of work like, I will develop in VS Code, like I'll be building things. Sometimes I'll paste in like the JSON and create an object there, and then test it. Maybe I'm trying to loop through things. And so I really like VS Code. I really use this just for Git, right? Easy way to sync stuff to GitHub.
Right.
But yes, yeah, that's a good call out, Jay. This right here, this reference right here will be your best friend if you are building connectors. There's a lot of great methods here, but you are kind of limited to this, and in order to build connectors, and then you'll be testing in the IDE. And so maybe it's a little bit of copy and pasting. I still think it's helpful. Definitely would recommend using something like VS Code to save for Git and version control.
To Elliott, thank you so much for your commentary. I think I just love hearing all of your ideas that you have about like how people could consider approaching Domo and all of the content you're creating. So thank you for taking the time to join us. Thanks, Jeff and Andrea and Dan, for being here and contributing your ideas. I did want to, in the last couple minutes that we have, kind of open up to questions that we might have from the community. So again, guys, just drop your questions in. But while you're putting in your questions, I have a question that I've been dying to ask. We know that in connectors, it is possible to spin up a Snowflake connector that has partition or UPSERT. But in a custom connector, is it possible to write our own partitioning, or do we know the answer to no? It's
not, unfortunately.
Okay. Oh, that makes me sad, but that's okay. I will, I can't understate how powerful like the Domo Jupyter Workspaces environment can be for creating your own version of a custom connector, right? Because for those of you who are using the Workspaces beta, you can generate output data sets that write to your data center. So that's a way that teams I've worked with are creating data sets from externally sourced data, or even some of the internal undocumented APIs will generate data sets using Jupyter Notebook. Another thing I'm working on creating is an alternative to PyDomo that allows you to create partitioned data sets. and UPSERT will be around the corner someday. So for those of you who have a background in Python, you don't have to learn JavaScript to write a connector. You can use Domo, Jupyter, or even GitHub code spaces to do some of that automation too. We did collect some questions from the community before this call, and some of them are pretty long and in-depth, but keeping on that theme of partition versus UPSERT, right? Can you speak to like when we might start seeing trade-offs, or mentally we might expect to start seeing trade-offs between UPSERT versus partition, like rough estimate, 50 million rows or less, UPSERT's going to be great. Do you have any kind of guidance there?
I hesitate to give row-specific guidance. When I'm talking to people about partitioning, I say, you know, you want to make sure that your partition is sufficiently large to take advantage of the performance benefits of partitioning, but sufficiently granular to be useful to you. And as you were talking about earlier, depending upon what your data is like, will really dictate whether or not you're leaning toward partitioning or UPSERT. UPSERT is definitely less efficient as it's doing the row by row scan. I don't know, Dan, do you have any guidelines you give?
Yeah, in fact, I actually come at it from the perspective that I'm going to default to partitioning and then use UPSERT more as a fallback. The trick with partitioning is it really does, the appropriateness of partitioning really does come down to the nature of the data and the nature of the way that the data is updated. So if there are a whole bunch of historical records being updated frequently, partitioning is less likely to be appropriate, because in that, so Jay, you mentioned date is typically a great partition key. That is exactly right. But imagine you've got a table of transactions, and for some reason you're making historical changes to those transactions. And let's say that those historical changes are kind of scattered throughout a year's worth of history. If you're doing partitioning, you're going to have to re-ingest in order to account for those smattering of changes through a year's worth of history. You're going to have to reprocess a year's worth of data, right? All 365 partitions. So that in that scenario, it's like, oh, that's maybe not such a great partition use case. Maybe we should look more at UPSERT. But for myself, I typically I start with the assumption I'm going to use partitioning, and then move away from that sort of as the conditions demand.
And to tie the thread over to Jeff's presentation, Jeff did mention that throughout in the pipeline that he stood up, on a daily basis, they update the last, I don't remember, 30 days or 7 days, whatever the number was. And then on the weekend, they update a larger chunk. So to Dan's point, you know, it might make sense. I'll do a rolling 7 days of partitions data. And then once a month, I'll do the last 90 days just to catch those laggards that maybe got changed way back when and nobody noticed in that rolling 7-day cycle. It's a pretty common design pattern from traditional BI.
Yeah, spot on. Like some kind of rolling window, because that's going to give you robustness, you know, against any kind of upset or any like latency in data becoming available. Some kind of rolling window, and then an occasional like true up, you know, once weekly or once monthly. Yep. Yeah.
And just a plug for partitioning in Magic, it comes with a companion feature called data selection or subset processing, which allows you to set that up right in the pipeline. So on Ingest, you can set up that variability and schedule.
And you can also do that in some of the partitioning connectors. So some of the connectors only allow you to specify like a rolling window. Others have this functionality, partition meta query. So you'll specify 2 queries. One is the main query to give me the data. The other is the query to define the partition tags that I want to work with.
Ooh, and so, can you give me some links? Can you list up, not now, but like a couple connectors to look at? That's pretty cool.
I know that one of the BigQuery connectors does that. I know that one of the Snowflake connectors does.
Nice.
I want to say that probably one of the Redshift connectors does as well. But what it allows you to do is say, if the connector runs on a weekday, only process a 7-day rolling window. If the connector runs on a weekend, process a 30-day rolling window or whatever. Super
I think
cool.
as I think the kind of final thought I want to kind of lay across the table. I know many of you guys who joined the presentation are longtime customers of Domo. Some of you have used Enterprise Stacker and Data Assembler, right? partition plus Magic ETL plus partitioning pretty much makes it unnecessary to turn to Data Assembler and Enterprise Stacker. So definitely take a look at that if that's an integral part of your pipeline. Also, those of you who have recursive data flows that are, again, filtered on like the last rolling 7 days or whatever, partition plus Magic ETL gets rid of the need for most of your recursive data flows. And again, huge performance boost opportunities there. Guys, thank you so much for joining. This has been a lot of fun. I just love pulling really smart brains into one, I was going to say room, but obviously we're on Google Meets. Thank you for taking the time to present. Everyone else, if you guys have questions, pop them in chat, send me an email. We'll get this recording up on YouTube, and we'll do all the things. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Jay. Thanks, y'all.
Hey, see ya.